The Watchers of the Forest. The trail was supposed to be easy, the kind you could do alone and return by dusk. John, an avid but amateur hiker, had decided that today was the day to push himself. The trail wound through the dense forest of the Appalachian Mountains, a peaceful place that whispered promises of solitude. John had always loved the quiet, and today he wanted to embrace it fully, alone. The idea of an 8-hour hike seemed exhilarating, a way to disconnect from the bustle of life. The day passed without incident. Trees towered above him, their leaves swaying gently in the mountain breeze. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dancing shadows on the forest floor. Birds chirped, and occasionally the rustling of a squirrel breaking through the undergrowth kept him company. John was in his element. Nature felt safe, predictable, and somehow comforting in its isolation. That was until he began his journey back. The sky had begun its slow descent into darkness, deep oranges and purples staining the horizon as John trekked along the path. The once clear trail had become unfamiliar. He paused, scanning his surroundings. Nothing looked right. The trees all seemed to blur together in an indistinguishable mass of green and brown. His heart began to race as he realized he didn't recognize where he was. Panic crept into his chest. "Calm down," he muttered to himself. He took a deep breath and checked his map. He had marked the trail earlier, but somehow everything felt wrong. The terrain no longer matched. He was lost. Night descended quickly, swallowing the forest in darkness. His flashlight flickered as he clicked it on, the beam weak and shaky. With no clear direction, John knew he couldn't wander aimlessly through the woods in the dark. The forest at night was an entirely different beast, dangerous and alive with things he couldn't see. As he tried to gather his thoughts, he stumbled upon something, an old cabin. Hidden behind overgrown bushes and thick vines, it looked like it had been abandoned for years. Its roof sagged, and the wooden walls were weathered, moss growing up the sides. Yet it was shelter. His flashlight was dying, and the thought of staying in the open terrified him more than the thought of sleeping in a decrepit cabin. At least here, he would have a roof over his head. John approached cautiously, knocking on the door out of courtesy. No response. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing unnervingly in the stillness of the night. Inside, the air was stale, and dust hung in the air, swirling in the dim light from his fading flashlight. Despite the decay, the cabin held an eerie kind of order. A single bed stood neatly in the center of the room, perfectly made, as if waiting for someone. John hesitated, but exhaustion clawed at him. After checking the small, single-room cabin, he found no sign of anyone. Surely no one had been here for years. His unease grew as his gaze fell on the walls. Surrounding the room, there were portraits, dozens of them, all in worn frames. The figures in the paintings were strange, their eyes unnervingly wide, mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. They all stared at him, each expression somehow more unsettling than the last. John shuddered, but convinced himself it was just his imagination playing tricks. He had no other choice. He needed to sleep. He lay down on the bed, trying to ignore the faces watching him from every corner. Exhaustion eventually overtook him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. Sometime deep into the night, he awoke suddenly. His skin prickled, as if someone, or something, was watching him. The room was eerily quiet, save for the soft creaking of wood settling in the night. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dark, and with a sense of mounting dread, he realized something was wrong. The portraits, the faces in them, they seemed to have moved. His pulse quickened. He sat up in bed, heart pounding in his chest. In the pale moonlight filtering through the broken window, the faces of the portraits appeared even more menacing. Their smiles seemed wider, their eyes more intense, as though they were actively watching him. Shaking it off as his imagination, John lay back down, trying to calm his nerves. He told himself it was just fatigue, the stress of being lost, but something deep within him screamed that he was not alone. When morning finally came, John sat up, groggy but relieved that the long night had ended. He rubbed his eyes and looked around, expecting to see the unsettling portraits that had disturbed his sleep. But what he saw instead made his blood run cold. There were no paintings. Instead, where the portraits had been, there were windows that had been there all along, windows with no glass, just open holes in the walls. And outside those windows, deep in the shadows of the forest, He could see them, the figures from the paintings. Real, living people standing just outside, staring at him with the same unnatural smiles. John's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. How had he not noticed the windows last night? And the people, no, they couldn't be people. There was something off, something twisted about the way they stood so still, so quiet. He jumped out of the bed, heart hammering in his chest, and backed away from the windows. The figures didn't move, but their eyes never left him. They just stood there, grinning, watching. Without another thought, John bolted for the door. He flung it open and ran. He didn't care where he was going anymore. He just needed to get away from the cabin, from those watchers. The forest closed in around him as he sprinted blindly through the trees. The eerie silence of the woods was broken only by the pounding of his own footsteps and the rasping of his breath. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The patient Dr. Michael Kessler had spent countless nights working the graveyard shift at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. He had grown used to the eerie quiet that settled over the place once the halls were empty and the visiting hours had ended. The hospital, known for its labyrinthine hallways and sprawling wings, was one of the oldest in the city, and its age showed in the creaks and groans of the building as night fell. St. Augustine was an efficient place, but also an unsettling one. The hospital had adopted a color-coded wristband system for its patients. Green meant the patient was alive, yellow indicated they were in critical condition, and red signified the deceased. The system worked smoothly, but the red bands had always unnerved Michael. Whenever he saw them, they were like a constant reminder of the fragility of life. It was on one such late night that Dr. Kessler received a call to fetch supplies from the basement, a task he dreaded. The basement was cold, dimly lit, and perpetually damp. The nurses joked that the basement was where the ghosts of former patients roamed, their spirits unable to leave. Michael, never one for superstition, had always dismissed their stories. But there was something about that night, something about the way the air felt heavier than usual, that made him feel uneasy as he walked toward the elevator. The hallway leading to the elevator was deathly quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he approached the lift, the distant hum of machines the only sound. He pressed the button and waited, the cold steel doors sliding open with a soft ding. Inside the elevator stood a woman, her back to him, looking down at her feet. She appeared to be a patient. Her hospital gown and the plastic bracelet around her wrist made that clear. Michael stepped inside, offering a polite nod to the woman. "Evening," he said, as he pressed the button for the basement. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even look up, which was strange, but Michael brushed it off. Patients often wandered the hospital at night to stretch their legs, especially the long-term ones. They had a rule to be back in their rooms by 10, but it wasn't uncommon for someone to push the curfew. As the elevator began its descent, Michael glanced at the woman from the corner of his eye. Something about her felt off, but he couldn't place what it was. Her skin looked pale under the harsh light of the elevator, and her dark hair hung limp around her face. Her eyes, half-lidded, seemed to be staring at nothing in particular. And there was one more thing. She hadn't pressed a button. Michael found that odd. Where was she going? When the elevator finally reached the basement, the doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and Michael stepped forward, ready to retrieve the supplies. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, a man, was limping toward the elevator from the far end of the basement corridor. His movements were slow and labored, his body bent as if under some immense weight. Even from a distance, Michael could see his face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. The man's right arm was extended toward the elevator, as if reaching out for help. Panic surged through Michael. His heart raced as he slammed his hand against the button to close the doors. The elevator shuddered, the doors inching shut, just as the man reached them. For a moment, their eyes met, those sunken, lifeless eyes that seemed to bore into Michael's soul. The doors finally clicked shut, and the elevator began its ascent back to the upper floors. Michael leaned against the wall, his chest heaving with each breath. His pulse pounded in his ears as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. The image of the man lingered in his mind, the way he had moved like he wasn't fully alive, and then he remembered the wristband. "Why did you do that?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. Michael looked up, startled. It was the woman. She was staring at him now, her eyes sharp and accusing. "That man needed the elevator," she said, her voice cold and calm. "Did you see his wrist?" Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It was red. He died last night. I would know, because I did his surgery." The woman's expression didn't change, but slowly, she lifted her own arm. Michael's heart stopped. On her wrist, there was a red band. She smiled, a slow, chilling smile that stretched across her face in a way that no smile should. "Like this one?" she asked, her voice low and full of malice. Michael stumbled backward, his mind reeling. His hands shook as he frantically jabbed at the elevator buttons, trying to make the lift move faster, to escape the suffocating presence of the woman. But no matter how many buttons he pressed, the elevator continued its slow, torturous climb. "Who are you?" Michael demanded, his voice rising in fear. The woman didn't answer. She simply stood there, her smile never wavering, her eyes locked onto his. As the elevator continued its ascent, the air grew heavier, colder, as if the very life was being drained from the room. Michael's skin prickled, and he could feel the presence of something wrong, something that didn't belong in this world. Suddenly, the lights in the elevator flickered, plunging the small space into darkness. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the elevator jolted to a stop, the doors refusing to open. In the pitch black, he could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate. And then, her voice, soft and chilling, whispered in the darkness. "We all wear the red band eventually, Doctor." The lights flickered back on, and she was gone. The elevator doors slid open, and Michael stumbled out into the hallway, his legs weak, his mind racing. He looked around, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. He was alone. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow on the polished floors. Breathing heavily, Michael staggered to the nurse's station. His hands shook as he gripped the counter, trying to steady himself. "There was a woman in the elevator with me," he stammered. "She had a red band. She shouldn't have been there." The nurse frowned, looking at him with concern. "Doctor, there are no patients with red bands on this floor tonight," she said gently. "All our deceased are in the morgue." Michael's blood ran cold. He knew what he had seen, and he knew who wore red bands. They were not the living. They were the dead. From that night on, Michael Kessler never worked the night shift again. The memory of the woman with the red band, the man in the basement, and the ghostly figures that haunted St. Augustine Memorial lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the thin veil between life and death. And every time he saw a patient with a red wristband, he couldn't help but wonder, were they really gone, or were they still watching, waiting in the shadows for their final goodbye? The door with no number. Jacob Bennett had always enjoyed a fresh start, and this move was no different. After weeks of apartment hunting, he had finally found an affordable place on the outskirts of town. The building wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, well-maintained, and offered him the peace he needed. Eager to settle in, he made his way to the reception desk to pick up the keys to his new apartment. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a stiff smile, handed him the key, but before letting go, she gave him an odd warning. "Welcome to the building, Mr. Bennett, but one thing. There's a door on your floor with no number. Please, don't disturb it, don't knock, don't try to open it, and definitely don't look inside." Jacob raised an eyebrow, perplexed. "Why?" The woman's smile faltered slightly, but she said nothing more, just shaking her head. Jacob, too excited to finally be moving in, shrugged it off. He figured it was just some quirky superstition or an old story residents like to tell. After thanking the receptionist, he made his way to his new apartment. Once inside, Jacob spent the next several hours unpacking, arranging furniture, and making the place feel like home. The building was old, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings that made sounds echo in the hallways, but it had charm. By the time he had finished settling in, it was well into the evening, and the only sound was the occasional hum of an air conditioning unit kicking on somewhere down the hall. But as Jacob sat back on his couch, sipping a drink and letting the tiredness settle over him, He found himself thinking about the receptionist's strange warning. Why would she tell him not to disturb a specific door? What could be behind it? His curiosity piqued. Jacob decided to investigate. He grabbed his keys and stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as he walked down the corridor, counting the doors. Apartment 301, 302. And then, there it was, an old wooden door with no number. It looked much like the others, but there was something eerie about it. The wood was darker, and the doorknob was dull and rusted, as if it hadn't been used in years. Jacob hesitated, but the temptation was too strong. He reached for the knob and twisted it gently. Locked. Of course. He sighed in mild disappointment, but the curiosity wouldn't leave him. Then an idea struck him. Dropping to his knees, he pressed his eye to the keyhole, peering into the dark apartment on the other side. At first, it was hard to see. His eye adjusted to the dim light in the room beyond, and slowly the details came into view. The apartment was eerily empty. No furniture, no decorations. Just blank, pale walls and a hardwood floor that looked almost untouched. But then, in the far corner of the room, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A woman. She stood with her back to him, facing the wall. Her long, black hair hung down her back, and her skin was ghostly pale, almost translucent. She was perfectly still, unmoving, as if in some kind of trance. Jacob jerked back from the keyhole, a chill running down his spine. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him, as if he had intruded on something private. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? And why was she just standing there, alone in an empty apartment? He forced himself to walk away, determined to forget the strange encounter. But as the night wore on, the image of the woman wouldn't leave his mind. Her pale skin, her long black hair, the unsettling stillness. It gnawed at him. Why had the receptionist warned him? Who was she? The next day, unable to shake his curiosity, Jacob found himself standing in front of the door again. This time, he didn't hesitate. Dropping to his knees, he peeked through the keyhole once more. But instead of the empty room and the woman, all he saw was red. A deep, overwhelming red, as if something was blocking the view. He blinked, confused. Had the woman covered the keyhole? Had she somehow known he was watching her? Disturbed and more than a little shaken, Jacob decided to confront the receptionist. He hurried down to the lobby, his mind buzzing with questions. When he reached the front desk, the receptionist was there, her eyes widening slightly as she saw him approach. "You looked through the keyhole, didn't you?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with disappointment. Jacob hesitated but nodded. Yeah, I did. There was a woman in there yesterday. But today, everything was red. What's going on?" The receptionist let out a long, weary sigh and glanced around to make sure no one else was nearby. "I was hoping you wouldn't get involved," she muttered, shaking her head. "But since you have, I suppose I owe you an explanation." She gestured for him to sit, her expression somber as she began to speak. A long time ago, a couple lived in that apartment. They were unusual, to say the least. The husband was a quiet, unassuming man, but his wife, she was something else. People said there was something wrong with her, that she wasn't quite human. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine, but remained silent, listening intently. They had pale skin, both of them, and long black hair. But the wife, her eyes. People said they were the most striking shade of red, like blood. No one really knew them well, but they were always polite when they passed in the halls. Everything seemed fine, until one night, the husband went mad. They say he killed her in a fit of rage, stabbing her repeatedly until the walls were soaked in blood. Jacob swallowed hard, his mouth dry. The receptionist's eyes were cold, distant, as if recalling a memory she had tried to forget. The strange part is, after the murder, the husband vanished. The police never found him, and the wife, well, they say her spirit still lingers. The apartment has been sealed off ever since. That's why I warned you not to disturb it. Jacob sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. The woman he had seen, could she really have been the ghost of the murdered wife? I saw her, Jacob whispered, standing in the corner, and today I saw nothing but red. The receptionist nodded grimly. That's because her eyes are watching you now. Once you've looked through the keyhole, she knows. She sees you just like you saw her. A cold dread settled over Jacob. The thought of those red eyes, burning with rage, following him, waiting for him, made his skin crawl. "I suggest you avoid that door from now on," the receptionist said softly. "There are some things in this world better left alone." Jacob left the reception desk in a daze, his mind swirling with fear and disbelief. That night, as he lay in bed, every creak and groan of the building seemed louder, more sinister. The darkness pressed in around him, suffocating, and he could feel a presence, something cold and malevolent, watching him from the shadows. And then, just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper at his door. Jacob's blood ran cold as he stared at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn. He didn't dare move. For behind the door with no number, the woman with the red eyes was waiting. The fire beneath the pier. In the quiet coastal town of Clearwater, nestled on the Gulf Coast of Florida, life moved at an unhurried pace. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, and gossip spread like wildfire. One could say that nothing ever truly surprising happened there, until that summer of 2012, when the bizarre and disturbing story of Amanda Dwyer, a 35-year-old schoolteacher, sent shockwaves through the community. Amanda had always been considered a model teacher. At Clearwater Middle School, she was well-liked by students and respected by her colleagues. But something changed in the early months of June. Friends, colleagues, and even some parents started noticing Amanda's odd behavior. It was subtle at first. She became more withdrawn, distant, and preoccupied. She started skipping social events and stopped interacting with people outside of work. Then came the shift in her interests. Amanda, who had never shown any particular interest in spiritual matters, became obsessed with the occult. She spoke vaguely of ancient rituals, purging the soul, and how darkness could be cleansed. Some chalked it up to a midlife crisis, while others dismissed it as just a phase. But no one could have predicted the dark turn her life would take. It wasn't until late June that the true depth of Amanda's unraveling came to light. On the night of June 23rd, Amanda gathered a small group of 7 former students at the Clearwater Pier, a quiet spot known for its stunning views of the sunset. It was an unusual place for a teacher to meet students, especially as dusk fell, but Amanda had always been close with these children. She had tutored them in middle school and had remained a mentor for some time after. Most of them were now in high school, and they trusted her implicitly. So, when she invited them to join her for a special gathering, none of them thought twice. The sun dipped below the horizon as Amanda stood by a small fire she had built near the edge of the pier. The flames flickered in the breeze, casting eerie shadows across her face. The students, seated around her, waited expectantly, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Amanda's voice was calm, almost soothing, as she explained the purpose of the gathering. According to her, the world was filled with dark spirits, demons that could possess and control people without them even realizing it. These demons, she claimed, had latched onto their souls and could only be exorcised through pain and purification. Her words were chilling, but none of the teenagers dared question her. They trusted her, and their loyalty ran deep. Amanda had always been a guiding figure, someone who had shown them kindness and support when they needed it most. But now, in the dim glow of the fire, her demeanor had changed. "We need to rid our bodies of the evil spirits that cling to us," Amanda said, her voice low and steady. "If we don't, they will consume us from the inside. We must release them." The students, confused but too afraid to disobey, watched as Amanda produced a small broken bottle. She instructed them to cut themselves, just small cuts, enough to let the evil spirits out. Hesitantly, one of the boys, Jason, who had always been close to Amanda, agreed to go first. With trembling hands, he took the broken bottle and made a shallow cut on his arm. Blood trickled down his skin, and Amanda smiled approvingly. "Now, we need to seal the wound so the spirits don't come back," she said, holding up a lighter. But as she flicked it, the wind picked up, and the flame sputtered out. Frustrated, Amanda grabbed a bottle of perfume from her bag. Without warning, she doused Jason's hand in the liquid and flicked the lighter again. This time, the flame caught, and Jason's hand ignited in a sudden burst of fire. He screamed, stumbling backward as the flames licked at his skin. The others watched in horror as Amanda calmly patted out the flames, her face emotionless. Jason's hand was red and blistered, the skin peeling where the fire had scorched it. He had suffered second-degree burns, but Amanda showed no concern. She merely nodded, as if satisfied with the outcome. "This is necessary," she said softly. "The pain will cleanse you." Terrified, but unable to break free from her control, the others stayed rooted to the spot. Amanda turned to another student, a girl named Megan, and demanded that she do the same. Megan hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, but Amanda's voice was firm. "You need to let the spirits out, Megan. If you don't, they will destroy you." Megan's hands shook as she picked up the broken bottle. Before she could make the cut, Amanda grabbed the bottle and slashed Megan's neck just below her ear. The cut was shallow, but blood quickly flowed from the wound. Megan gasped in pain, her hand flying to her neck in shock. Without missing a beat, Amanda pulled a small metal key from her pocket and held it over the fire, heating it until it glowed red hot. Then, she pressed the key to Megan's neck, cauterizing the wound with a sickening sizzle. Megan cried out in agony, but Amanda merely watched, her eyes cold and detached. By now, the students were paralyzed with fear. Some wanted to run, but the fear of Amanda's wrath and the hold she seemed to have over them kept them frozen in place. They had always known her as a caring mentor, but tonight, she was someone else entirely. It was only by sheer luck that help arrived. Unbeknownst to Amanda, one of the students, Brian, had told a friend about the gathering earlier that day. Suspicious and uneasy about Amanda's strange behavior, the friend had followed them to the pier and watched from a distance. When he saw what was happening, he ran to a nearby payphone and called the police. When officers arrived, they found Amanda standing by the fire, calmly talking to the terrified students. Jason was cradling his burned hand, and Megan was trembling, blood still oozing from the cauterized wound on her neck. The sight was shocking. A quiet summer evening turned into a scene of horror. Amanda was arrested on the spot, her face blank and emotionless as they led her away in handcuffs. The students were taken to the hospital, where their injuries were treated. None of them spoke to the police immediately. They were too scared, too confused by the events that had transpired. It wasn't until later, when the shock had worn off, that the full story came out. Amanda Dwyer was charged with aggravated battery and child abuse. During her interrogation, she refused to explain what had motivated her actions. Investigators asked her about the rituals, the supposed demons, but Amanda only smiled vaguely, never offering a clear answer. She was locked away, but the scars she left on those 7 students, both physical and emotional, would last a lifetime. As for the community of Clearwater, it would never forget the horror that had unfolded on that warm June night. Amanda Dwyer had once been a respected teacher, but in the end, she became something far more sinister. A woman consumed by dark beliefs, who inflicted pain on those who trusted her most. And though the pier has since been rebuilt, locals still avoid it after dark, whispering of the fire that once burned beneath the stars and the demons that Amanda believed she had set free. The Stalker. In the quiet town of Riverview, Oregon, strange happenings began to unfold in the fall of 2007, an unsettling mystery that would haunt 3 families for months and bring terror to the hearts of everyone in the small community. It all started with a phone call, the first of many that would soon become a nightmare. The Miller family was the first to receive the chilling messages. It was a late October evening when Lisa Miller's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She picked it up, expecting to see a harmless text or a missed call. Instead, the message read, "I'm watching you. I see you in your yellow sweater, in your kitchen. Say goodbye to your kids." Lisa's hands shook as she read the words, her heart pounding in her chest. The message described her down to every detail. The yellow sweater she had been wearing all day, her position at the kitchen counter, and even her 2 young daughters who were playing in the living room just a few feet away. She scanned the room in a panic, her mind racing. There was no one there, but the phone didn't lie. Someone had been watching her. That night was just the beginning. The calls and messages began to come at all hours, often in the dead of night when the family was asleep. Each time, the anonymous voice on the other end would speak in a scratchy, distorted tone, threatening to kill Lisa, her husband David, and their daughters. The caller seemed to know everything about them, what they were wearing, where they were going, and even private conversations they had in their home. Lisa, terrified and desperate, contacted the local police. Detective John Keller was assigned to the case, and though he was initially skeptical, the evidence was too disturbing to ignore. The caller left voicemails with recordings of the Millers' conversations, including a private discussion between Lisa and Keller himself during one of their meetings at the police station. The calls continued, even when the Millers' phones were switched off. Things escalated when the Simmons family, who lived just a few blocks away, started receiving similar calls. The messages followed the same eerie pattern: details about their lives, threats against their children, and an uncanny knowledge of their daily activities. One particularly chilling message described what their teenage son, Ethan, had been doing the previous night. The voice spoke of how Ethan had stayed up late in his room, scrolling through his phone and listening to music, unaware that he was being watched. The final family to be targeted was the Johnsons. Laura Johnson, a local teacher, received a voicemail that made her blood run cold. The voice, raspy and malevolent, told her that her mother, who lived with them, would die that night unless she followed specific instructions. Laura frantically called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of the caller. Her mother, unharmed but shaken, hadn't heard a thing. The police were at a loss. Detective Keller and his team launched an investigation, but every lead came to a dead end. They tried tracing the calls, only to discover that they were coming from the victims' own phones, even when those phones were turned off. It was as though the stalker had gained access to the devices, turning them into tools of terror. Worse yet, the calls and messages continued to pour in, despite the police's best efforts to track the perpetrator. Frustration mounted as Keller turned to tech experts for answers. But the findings were disturbing. It appeared that the caller was exploiting some kind of advanced hacking technique, using the victims' cell phones not just to make calls, but to spy on them in real time. The phone's cameras and microphones were being accessed remotely, allowing the stalker to watch and listen to everything the families did, even in their most private moments. The town of Riverview buzzed with fear. Rumors swirled that the culprit was some tech-savvy criminal or a twisted hacker with too much power. Others believed it was something more sinister, something beyond the grasp of human understanding. The more superstitious whispered about dark forces, spirits who could inhabit machines and control them from the shadows. As the weeks passed, the Millers, Simmonses, and Johnsons became prisoners in their own homes. They changed their routines, avoiding leaving the house whenever possible, and lived in constant fear of the next phone call. The Millers even installed security cameras and motion detectors around their home, but the cameras caught nothing out of the ordinary. The sense of being watched, however, never left them. Then, just as mysteriously as it had begun, the calls stopped. For a brief period, the families dared to hope that it was all over. Perhaps the stalker had grown bored, or maybe the police investigation had scared them off. But then, a new threat emerged. In December of that year, the Connors family moved into a sprawling house in a wealthier part of town. It was an expensive property, bought with the life savings of John and Megan Connors, who hoped it would be the perfect place to raise their 2 children. But shortly after moving in, they started receiving letters from someone calling themselves the Watcher. The letters were unlike anything they had ever seen. The Watcher claimed that their new home had been under surveillance for decades, and that they were simply the latest family to live there. "I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming," one letter read. Another, more menacing letter asked, "Have you found out what's hidden in the walls yet?" The Connors family, alarmed, contacted the police, but no evidence was found to suggest who might be behind the letters. They received several more messages over the following weeks, each one more disturbing than the last. "I am pleased to know your children's names now," read one particularly chilling letter, "and the name of the young blood you have brought to me." Desperate to protect their children, the Connorses fled the house and filed a lawsuit against the previous owners, accusing them of failing to disclose the unsettling history of the property. But the watcher was never found. The fear that had gripped Riverview spread to other nearby towns. Stories of stalkers and watchers began to emerge from other places, fueling speculation that the town itself was cursed. For the Miller, Simmons, and Johnson families, the scars from those terrifying months would never fade. The constant surveillance, the threats, and the feeling of helplessness lingered long after the phone calls stopped. To this day, the mystery of the Riverview phone stalker remains unsolved. Some believe it was the work of a deranged hacker with a twisted agenda. Others think it was something far darker, a malevolent force that used technology to feed on fear. Whatever the truth, the legend of the phone stalker is still told in Riverview, a chilling reminder that even in the digital age, we are never truly alone. The haunting of Fairview Lodge. The Fairview Lodge had stood proudly in the small town of Silver Creek, Oregon, for over a century. Built in 1910, as a luxurious retreat for the wealthy, the sprawling mountain lodge became a symbol of opulence, drawing in elite guests who sought the serene beauty of the surrounding wilderness. But by the 1970s, the grandeur of the Fairview had faded, its once glamorous halls now echoing with emptiness. The lodge fell into disrepair, its charm lost to time. For decades, rumors had swirled about the lodge's haunted reputation. Guests spoke of strange sounds, flickering lights, and shadows that moved where no one stood. The locals of Silver Creek kept their distance, convinced the lodge had become a resting place for restless spirits. Despite the rumors, it wasn't until the late 1980s, when a famous author wrote a chilling novel inspired by the lodge, that the ghost stories reached national attention. Soon, tourists from around the world flocked to Silver Creek, eager to spend a night in the haunted lodge that had inspired one of the scariest books of the 20th century. By 2016, Fairview Lodge had regained some of its former glory. It was fully restored, its once decaying walls now bright with fresh paint, and its rooms once again filled with curious visitors. Henry Cho, a resident of Portland, Oregon, had always been fascinated by ghost stories, so when he found himself with a few days off in April, he decided to book a last-minute getaway to Silver Creek. His goal? To see if the legends about Fairview Lodge were true. "I had heard about the place for years," Henry said later. "I figured, why not see if it's really as haunted as everyone says?" Henry arrived at the lodge on a sunny afternoon. The building was impressive, its old-world charm still intact, despite its eerie reputation. After checking in, Henry had dinner in the lodge's grand dining hall, an elegant space with high ceilings, chandeliers, and large windows that overlooked the mountain range. The food was excellent, but it wasn't the cuisine that Henry was here for. After finishing his meal, he grabbed his camera and decided to explore. Wandering through the halls, Henry was struck by the stillness of the place. Though the lodge was bustling with guests, there was a strange hush that seemed to hang over everything. He made his way to the grand staircase, one of the most famous features of Fairview Lodge, and waited patiently for other tourists to clear the area. Once he had the space to himself, he took a photo of the empty staircase, its wooden banisters gleaming in the dim light. Satisfied, he continued to explore. But something changed that evening. As the sun began to set, Henry started to feel unwell. At first, it was just a mild discomfort, an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach. But as the evening progressed, the sensation grew worse. A chill settled over him, and despite the warmth of the lodge, he couldn't stop shivering. "I felt really sick," he recalled later. "I had the shivers, and there was this overwhelming sense that something was wrong." His travel companion, worried by his sudden illness, urged him to go to the emergency room, but Henry refused, chalking it up to exhaustion from the drive or maybe something he had eaten. He decided to sleep it off and headed to bed early that night, hoping he would feel better in the morning. But sleep brought no relief. Throughout the night, Henry was plagued by disturbing dreams, shadowy figures moving through his room, strange voices whispering his name, and a suffocating presence that weighed heavily on his chest. He woke several times, drenched in cold sweat, his heart racing. The next morning, exhausted and still feeling unwell, Henry decided to cut his trip short. On the drive back to Portland, he scrolled through the photos he had taken at the lodge, hoping to distract himself from the lingering sense of unease. Most of the images were ordinary, shots of the lodge's beautiful architecture, the surrounding mountains, and the grand dining hall. But then he came to the photo of the staircase. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual. But as he zoomed in, his heart skipped a beat. There, at the base of the staircase, was the unmistakable outline of a figure that hadn't been there when he took the photo. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face pale and expressionless. She seemed to be staring directly at the camera, her eyes dark and hollow. Henry's blood ran cold as he stared at the image, his mind racing. He had been alone when he took that photo. There had been no one else in the hallway. And yet, here she was, standing in the shot, as clear as day. Trying to calm his nerves, Henry rationalized that it could have been a trick of the light, a strange reflection, or maybe even another guest he hadn't noticed. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. That night, back in Portland, Henry posted the photo on Instagram with a half-joking caption about capturing a ghost. He didn't think much of it until the next morning when his phone exploded with notifications. The photo had gone viral, attracting the attention of media outlets and paranormal experts from around the world. People flooded the comments with their theories. Some claimed it was a genuine ghost, while others suggested it was an elaborate prank. Paranormal experts analyzed the image and came to conflicting conclusions. Some believed the figure was a manifestation of an actual spirit, while others thought it was the result of the ghost trying to materialize, draining Henry of his energy and causing his illness. There was another, more chilling theory, that the ghost wasn't alone. If you look closely, one paranormal investigator wrote, you can see a second figure behind her in the shadows. The thought of not one, but two spirits haunting the staircase sent shivers down Henry's spine. And it wasn't just the photo that unsettled him. It was the knowledge that he had felt something that night. The sickness, the dreams, the overwhelming feeling of dread, it all seemed to connect to the moment he had taken that photo. For weeks after the trip, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision, hear faint whispers when he was alone, and feel that same suffocating presence he had experienced at the lodge. His sleep was plagued by nightmares, always of the woman at the staircase, her dark eyes following him wherever he went. Henry's encounter at Fairview Lodge became a sensation, and the photo was examined by countless experts. But despite all the attention, no one could explain exactly what had happened that night, or why Henry had fallen ill after taking the picture. To this day, the lodge remains a popular destination for those seeking a brush with the supernatural. And though Henry has never returned, the memory of that night, the ghostly woman, the sickness, the shadows, still haunts him. He never did find out who or what had been watching him from the staircase. But he knew one thing for certain: some things once seen can never be forgotten.